Hello. I have constructed a delightful little hole for myself in my closet out of cardboard boxes and stuffed animals so that my family can't hear me. Or maybe they can, but not as well. And it does what I want it to do. So, I can come on the internet and share my opinions that nobody asked for, of which I have many. And that is what I'm going to do today about something that has nothing to do with feminism or detransition. I mean, it's kind of related. It's related to, that side of politics and the kind of people on it. So, and I wrote some things down. It may not look like much, but I have a plan today. So hopefully this will be better than when I just sit here and talk for an hour and a half. But we'll see. So, what I want to talk about today is culture and tradition and white people and the white left and why I think people's attitudes really need to change on it. So, gosh, I think we all are aware of the phenomena, right? Young people, the internet, phones, social media. Oh no. Um, but really, on the left today, especially online, young people, whatever, there is a strong rejection of tradition. There is a strong rejection of culture to the point that people say things that just aren't true, like, oh, there's no such thing as American culture, or there's no such thing as white culture or whatever. And obviously that's false, right? If you think that those don't exist, then chances are you're just so immersed in it that you aren't aware of it. They do exist, and furthermore, I want to argue that they're important and that we need to reconnect with our culture and, with family, right, with our communities, because I think a big reason why people are so miserable now is that they've grown very disconnected. And this is something that has been widely discussed. I mean, there's no real need for me to get into the atomization of industrialized societies, um, the dividing up of families, right, from extended families, from whole towns, right, where maybe everybody was kind of related to each other, to more close knit extended families, down to the nuclear family, and down to the point now where a lot of people are cutting their families off and want nothing to do with their families. And I have opinions about that, but we'll get to that. So, how does culture and tradition work? Why do I think it's important? So, at the most basic level, cultures and traditions give you context or a framework for your life, right? It gives you a sense of belonging. It provides a structure of meaning in your life. There are events and milestones in your life that are marked culturally, whether that's, you know, birthdays, even, annual holidays where you gather with family, marriage, death, funerals, right? This is all part of how we structure our lives, how we give ourselves meaning, and how we sort of connect with each other and also provide a sense of meaning around our lives and around the things that we do. And this is super important, right? We see in any majority culture, under most circumstances, certainly most modern circumstances, there's less sense of connection and less emphasis on family, and less importance is placed on those things. And at the same time, people become lonelier, people struggle with meaning, right? They feel depressed, they feel a sense of existential dread around life, and they feel like they're missing something, right? They just go through the day-to-day motions, but there's nothing really behind it. They don't feel like they derive anything of value from it. And this is where, being connected with your family, being connected with a history, with a culture, with a religion is important, in my opinion, right? I mean, it's always going to be true to some extent that minority groups within a culture will feel a greater sense of closeness to each other. They will focus more on family. They will focus more on their own culture and their own traditions than the same people would if they were living somewhere where they were the majority in a society, right? Because there's this external pressure. If you live in an environment that is somewhat hostile or that you perceive as being hostile or different from you, there is this external pressure in on the group that binds them together more so than if you're just kind of floating in space, i.e., if you're the majority culture, if you're white in America, right? There's nothing to push us together. So you'll see things like Judaism, right? I would say probably half of Jewish people I know are not religious at all, but they still call themselves Jews. They still go to different Jewish celebrations. They may not actually go to the synagogue very often, but they will have, if they get married, they have a Jewish wedding. They go to their, nephews and nieces and kids, bar mitzvahs. They do all of that because there's this external pressure that keeps the group together in a sense. And you see that in a lot of contexts, right? And you look at religion in America, for example. This is a great example. Which religion has declined the most as people have lost religious faith? It's mainline Protestant religion, right? It was the religion that was held by the majority because there's no external pressure, right? Whereas people, even just Catholics, tend to stick to Catholicism more, even if they personally are not that religious, because it's a cultural framework for them, and their whole lives it has been somewhat in opposition to the people around them. Now, it depends on where you are. If you're in the Northeast, that's probably not the case. But if you're in the South like me, that is the case. And, my neighbors who are Catholic, they are still involved in certain life cycle events that take place in the church, even though I don't know so much about their mom, who's like my mom's age. But as for the kids, the girls, they are not religious, right? But they still are sort of involved in these events that happen within the context of the church because that's, culturally important to them. Zooming out a little bit, when I'm talking about white culture, first of all, I'm specifically speaking in an American context, so just to make that clear, I'm not talking about anything you haven't heard of. I'm talking about how we raise our kids. I'm talking about, our views of education, what a traditional marriage looks like, the types of funerals we hold, right? That differs a lot from other groups, even within the US, how, white funerals are a very specific thing. And just, our day to day life, Christmas, family reunions, what do we gather over, the kinds of food we eat, so on and so forth. And I think this is a big part of the disconnect when people say there's no such thing as white culture or there's no such thing as American culture or white culture is just cringy or whatever. They they're looking for these very specific things that other people don't do, right? Whereas really most cultures, they're things pretty much everyone does, but everybody does it a little bit differently, right? All cultures have funerals, all cultures have marriages, all cultures have children and ways that they raise their children. It's the details that vary. And so, you can say, well, in black culture, usually the funeral is held, you know, the second weekend after somebody dies. And you can pin that as being sort of part of the black funeral tradition, right? Very, expensive kind of wakes and like big, a funeral as a really big social event, you can pin that as like, okay, well, that's part of black culture, right? And it's not any different, right? The fact that white funerals tend to be the Saturday after the person dies, barring them dying on Friday night or whatever, that's part of white culture. The fact of, open casket funerals, right? Funerals being sort of subdued events, people don't tend to scream and cry. They also don't tend to throw a big party or anything like that. Like, that's part of the culture. You don't necessarily have to love that. You don't have to find that exciting and delightful, but that is nonetheless part of your culture, right? If you're white. I've already said a little about like why I think this stuff is important and why I think it's important that you don't just walk away from these things and lose these things. Um, but I think, almost a better example is what happens when you don't have them, which is what we see with a lot of younger people now. They just feel like their life is meaningless. They're very prone to, psychological distress. And they just have trouble feeling satisfied in life. And they start looking for satisfaction in other places. This is a bit of a pet peeve of mine, but, the focus on money, right? And the number of people who are like, I don't get fair wages, who make like 50K plus is distressing to me. They look for, other systems, other structures. So, that could be they get really into socialism or communism, some other political movement. They get really into progressive activism, maybe. But that's not the same, right? It can check some of those boxes of maybe giving you meaning or a purpose, giving you something to sort of focus on, maybe a sense of belonging, but also maybe not. I mean, I don't think family is something that can easily be replaced like that. And it ultimately can be very empty, as in, you know, unless you're working for a cause you really care about, if you achieve what you wanted, and a lot of the times then it's like, oh, right, well, this isn't, I'm not happy still, right? Because it wasn't what was causing you to be unhappy to begin with. And I see this a lot with money, and it's just something that I have to bring out because I've never made much money. I don't think I've ever even broken the poverty line before at any job I've had. And I was surrounded by certain individuals who I will not name or give specific details about, but there were several of them, and they all made several multiples of my yearly income. They were single adults with no dependents, no serious health conditions, nothing that would like suck away their money more than my money was getting sucked away. And yet they would always complain about how poor they were. I had a manager, I'm getting a little specific here. I had a manager at my first job who was making easily 2 to 3 times what I did, who would always complain about being poor, and he went out to eat every night. He bought new clothes on an almost weekly basis. He drank heavily. He spent a lot of money on expensive, nice alcohol, etc., etc. He had lots of money, and then he would spend it all, and he was broke at the end of the month, and then he would complain about how poor he was. That is not being poor. You being broke at the end of the month is not being poor. Being poor is not having enough money to cover your basic needs. But this seems to have been forgotten. And I knew several people who saw money this way, as like, oh, if I get a better job, if I make more money, I will be satisfied in my life. I still have somebody who's very close to me who's like this, and it drives me a little bit crazy, but we've agreed to disagree, and we don't talk about money anymore because I find it so irritating to discuss money with her, and her idea that basically she needs a six-figure income to be happy. But in some ways, it makes sense, right? Money is very practical. If you're not happy in life, if you need things in life, well, what do you need is money. But when you want things in life or you need things that aren't material, money can't get you that. But it's very easy when you're used to viewing things in that framework of I need something, money is the answer, to keep feeling that way. And I know a lot of people who feel that way. Ironically, one or more were communists, and it drove me nuts the fact that in an actually equal world, you would have less and not more. Um, I mean, if you're in the US, that's universally true. And I mean, if you want to argue with me about this, well, let's go in the comments because I have a lot to say about people's ideas of redistribution and what they think is redistributable, which is they think a lot of things are redistributable that are not redistributable, right? Your $20 million house cannot be redistributed into $100,000, $200,000 houses, right? The material isn't there. The artwork cannot be redistributed. Most of the investments cannot be redistributed. The money just sitting in bank accounts, you redistribute that and prices just go up because the actual things that are needed, right? Food, housing, medicine, basic supplies, basic things in life, there's a limited supply of those. So you just give everyone money and then prices go up, right? You can't just redistribute all that. And in terms of what's actually redistributable, instead of trying to measure global wealth or whatever, I mean, what you should look at is global GDP. And my dog is under the desk, whatever. I was on a roll there, so I'm just going to keep talking. Global GDP is an actual representation of the amount of goods and services that can be moved around and distributed, right? That can be produced in a year. And by that measure, you're not, in an equal world, we're talking about, I think I did the calculation at one point, it's somewhere in the range of $11,000 per person. Now, I'm not saying that that's the quality of life you would live at, because that's everywhere, and in most places prices are lower. So an actual lifestyle equivalent might be like $20,000 a year. So if you're making $35,000 a year, $40,000 a year, $50,000 a year, more, like somebody who I know personally and will not name, and you think that you're poor, I've got news for you. Communism is not the answer, because you will have less and not more. I know I really have the potential to go off on that. That's what I call pop communism, by the way. If anyone's ever been in like a live stream with me and heard me complain about pop communism, that's what I'm referring to, is a communism that, or a socialism that is based in selfishness, right? It's not about wanting the best for other people. It's not about other people's like oppression, actually poor people. It's about selfishness. It's about me, me, me. I want more money. I feel like the capitalist economy is not giving me enough material goods. It's not giving me enough money. It's not giving me enough excess, and I want more, right? And it's among people who aren't actually poor. They don't actually need anything. They just want more. They want more clothing. They want to go out to eat more. They want expensive food. They want designer clothes. They want to be able to pay and to drink expensive alcohol every night. And they want to go on international vacations to the other side of the world and all this stuff. And it's like, your ideas here are deeply flawed. And I know in this general space of YouTube, wherever I'm involved, a lot of people are communist, socialist, whatever. And I do draw a line. I am not personally a communist, because it doesn't seem to work in real life. And people say, oh, well, theoretically it works. Well, I can say the same thing about capitalism. Theoretically, capitalism works great too. But the actual results for both do speak to the fact that, well, neither is perfect. Capitalism, in my opinion, works better than communism. Now, can you involve more social policies, blah, blah, blah? That's a more nuanced debate. But, like, as a general rule, if we're talking about people who I, like, actually actively dislike or look down upon for their opinions, I draw a line here between, people who are communists because they think it's best for other people and they actually want other people to live better lives. People who are truly poor, people who lack things like food, medicine, housing, that's really important, and I respect that. But then there's this whole other group that seems to be the majority now, that's just people who are selfish pieces of shit and want more for themselves, and they feel like they don't make enough money even when they make, more than enough money to live a completely comfortable lifestyle, and that just like enrages me and pisses me off, and I like to complain about it. So that's that. In terms of like finding other meaning in life, most people don't really take it that far to where they actually attach themselves to an ideology. A lot of the time, what ends up happening is people just tell themselves that the next thing is better. Like, when I graduate from school, when I get a better job, when I get promoted, when I get married, when I have kids, when I retire, blah, 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 right? you keep delaying it and telling yourself, this will make me happy, this will make me happy, this will make me happy. Um, not not unrelated. People who transition do the same thing. I'll be happy when I pass. I'll be happy when I am on hormones. I'll be happy when I'm on surgery. I'll be happy when I get this and this and this, and then it never happens. But that's not what this video is about anyway. Or they just distract themselves, right? They get super involved. They sit on the internet all day, or they play video games obsessively, things like that, where they're not necessarily actively searching for anything else. They're just trying to distract themselves from the fact that they feel so like empty and bored with life and like nothing matters and miserable and anxious and whatever. Um, but they are actively encouraged to avoid what I think is the obvious answer, which is to turn to your family, to turn to the people around you, and the traditions and the things that remind you of happier times or the past, or make you feel connected with those things. And yet that's really like actively discouraged, especially in online leftist spaces. um, I mean, there's multiple reasons for that, right? Specifically, if you are white, which is what this video is primarily about, because I don't know if you noticed, but I'm white. Um, it's discouraged because that is associated with right wing nationalism, right? To some extent, I mean, to a large extent, especially Christianity, and those specific aspects of white culture. To a lesser extent, also the occult. I don't think this is as true as it used to be, but definitely in the 90s, there was this weird overlap between like Euro pagan spirituality and white nationalism in the US. That is less of a thing, much less of a thing than it was 30 years ago. But there's still a degree of association with that. Now, the left has taken that back because that's something alternative. But when it comes to what are the actual traditions that you directly come from, that is still heavily discouraged and looked down upon for a variety of reasons. I mean, there's the association with the right, obviously. There's also just, this attitude that the left encourages. It's almost its own form of like ignorance of it's like the left wing version of being proud to be ignorant is this whole like there's no such thing as white culture, or white culture is cringe culture, or America doesn't have a culture, whatever. It's almost like the same idea of like being ignorant and proud of it, because you're trying to dissociate yourself from whatever the opposite is, right? So on the right, when somebody's proud of their ignorance, they're trying to dissociate with themselves from like academia and like universities and very liberal, very progressive circles that overlap with being more educated. And on the left, it's, you're trying to dissociate yourself from white nationalism with these aspects of white culture that you don't like. And so you're saying, oh, well, I don't even know that it exists. It doesn't exist. I've never heard of it. It's all made up. White culture is just, stealing from other people and like, whatever edgy, snarky comment you want to insert here about it. Um, but just like it's foolish to avoid becoming educated because you don't like people who are educated or how they act. It's, I think, equally foolish to cut yourself off like that and just send yourself, sort of floating unanchored through society for your whole life. I don't think that's good. And, I think it's important to feel a sense of connection and to, you don't have to be a Christian. I mean, I wouldn't call myself a Christian. You don't have to relate to or adopt everything that's put in front of you, but I think to dismiss it all wholesale without looking at or considering any of it or the benefits it can offer you, I think that's a really bad idea. And that you should at least familiarize yourself with that stuff. because it could have a lot to offer you. I specifically wanted to make sure I talk about family in particular and how family is viewed and how, among young left wing people who are white in America, very specific group of people, but there has been a real push away from family and the importance of family and the idea of family as something that roots you and something that is protective for you and something that gives you meaning. And I think it's all of those things. I mean, family is the most basic form of social security. It's the most basic form of protection, of welfare, of, it's what stands between you and the street, right? If you lose your job, if you have a drug problem, if you, for whatever reason, you have found yourself in a situation where you can't pay the rent, who do you turn to? Right? If you don't have family to turn to, you're screwed. You're going to be homeless. I mean, good luck on the housing waiting lists, if you're even eligible. I mean, if you're not a single mom with kids, you're probably not going to get any kind of public housing or a Section 8 voucher or anything, right? Your family, that's the first stop, right? And in many cases, it's the only stop. Um, that's important. More than that, your family is where you come from. It's your genetics. I mean, in most cases, unless you're adopted, it's where, you can see yourself in other people, right? I find that extremely meaningful and extremely important to me is that I can look at pictures from 100 plus years ago and I can see somebody who looks like me and I can read stories about them and they have these little quirks of their personality. One of my favorite things is, I have my grandma, my maternal grandma. I've always been told that I look exactly like her. And as I've gotten older, to see that there is sort of this genetic connection that goes kind of deeper, when people tell stories about her and like, the mouth she had, the creative use of language, the way she would talk to people and argue with people. And it sounds so much like me in a way that, I mean, it really does. It makes me happy. It gives me this sense of connection and of meaning that I'm more than like this individual floating in space with no connections and nothing that makes me who I am. Even the parts of me that are not necessarily good things to, trace that through my family history and to see other people who act like me and who have the same problems I do, even. I find that comforting and I think that's really useful and important. And, you know, the way that family is discussed, which is to say it isn't except in a negative context, I think is a big problem. People are encouraged to cut their family off over things that are not justified, right? And I have to be careful how I kind of go about this, talk about this. I will be very forward and say that it's reached a point now where when I see somebody say they grew up in an abusive home or their parents are abusive, their mom's abusive, whatever, a majority of times I am skeptical. I am extremely skeptical of that now because the definition of abuse has seemingly intentionally been broadened to such an absurd extent that there almost seems to be like this goal of atomization, this goal of getting people to split themselves off from family, from toxic family members, which at this point, I mean, the word toxic literally just means I don't like this person, it's like not any kind of specific trait. It's just like, oh, they're mean sometimes, or they're annoying, or they're overbearing or controlling or whatever. And it's like, that's that's not that's not abuse, guys. And I would say I've been active talking about my life in various forms and places on the internet for about 10 years now. And that whole time, and it's gotten worse. It's gotten worse as time goes on. I will tell a story about my childhood, talk about something that happened with my mom that day that's bothering me, and almost without fail, at least one person, often more, will respond to whatever I've said and the word abuse will be used, such as, oh, I also grew up with an abusive mom, or, you know, that sounds abusive, it makes me so angry, stuff like that. And it makes me very uncomfortable. And it makes me very uncomfortable because I don't like this broadening of the definition of abuse. I think it is actively damaging to people and to the society as a whole when we take anything that isn't idealized perfect behavior and say that's abusive. Not because it couldn't technically fit a definition, but because the word abuse has a connotation that is very different and much more severe than just doing something that you shouldn't do to someone, right? Abusive is not just a descriptive word, right? It's a value judgment. When you call someone abusive, that is very different from saying that they were mean to you. When you call someone abusive, you're saying this is an abusive person. And that is the context that surrounds it, whether you actually say that or not. The implication when you call someone abusive is that they are abusive as a character trait. It's not something they did, it's who they are, and therefore you should get rid of them. You can't be around them because they're abusive, right? Whereas there's been a big drop off in using just normal language to describe these behaviors. Like, I would call my mom mean. She can definitely be mean sometimes. She definitely does not treat others the way that she expects to be treated. She is definitely rude, but she's also very caring. She lets me live in her home for free. She is somebody who I would describe as ride or die, which is to say that no matter what's going on in my life, I will always have a place to stay here. My mom's never going to cut me off, even if maybe other people have in the past many times encouraged me to cut my mom off. My mom would never do that to me. She's a whole human being. She's not just, oh, you know, she called you fat once. She said you were ugly. Oh my God, your mom's abusive. I find that very, like, ugh, like, I don't like hearing that because it's just like, you are just throwing nuance right out the window here. You're just like, you are judging these people as good or evil, and either somebody is good and they basically, follow all the pop psych guides as to how you're supposed to manage your personal relationships now. It's very particular. Everybody's a narcissist now. Everybody gaslights people now. All this pop psych terminology that flies around, and it's terrible. I think it's really terrible for people because there are people out there whose parents are actually abusive, first of all, who actually grew up in really bad environments and who, for whatever reason, their parents are still like that. They really can't be around them and whatever. But when you expand that out to people where it's just like, oh, your mom's kind of mean, like mine is, or, your mom maybe has an eating disorder and she pushed you to diet from, age 12 or whatever. And yeah, that's terrible. Your mom shouldn't have done that. But, like, that's not the same as her being a terrible, abusive, horrible human being who you need to cut off and never speak to again, right? There's space here. There's a whole spectrum between wonderful person who you love and is excellent and amazing to you all the time and abusive person so terrible that you cannot be around them and not speak to them. And guess what? Nobody is here. You're not here either. And if you think you are misremembering. And I always wonder about this when I read people's descriptions of, like, oh, my abusive childhood where my mom yelled at me and sometimes said mean things to me. And it's like, I always wonder, what are you leaving out here? What were you like? What did you say back? Because, God knows we've all said terrible things to our parents or our siblings, especially, in adolescence or as young adults. And, like, this denial of, like, that you haven't done anything wrong, or more to the point, this belief that, the wrongs that other people commit against you, those matter and you're going to hold those in your head for the rest of your life. But the wrongs that you've committed against other people, like, that's meaningless or that's excusable or I was young or blah, blah, blah. Well, maybe your mom was young too, How old was she when she had you? I think about that. I'm the same age my mom was when she started trying to have kids, and, like, this idea that, like, if I yell at my children, they're going to remember it for the rest of their lives, and, like, people are going to tell them I was abusive or something is just super fucked up to me. I don't agree with that, and I think it's extremely just damaging, and I don't know. I'll get to more. Something else that I also notice in regard to family is, when I say it's harmful, it's damaging, whatever, I think that there is an active strategy to some extent in parts of the left to encourage people to isolate themselves. Now, what do I mean by that? Do I think it's the majority? No. Do I think most people encouraging people, like, oh, your mom's abusive because she called you fat once, are most of those people intentionally trying to perpetuate that? Probably not. But there is a clear active strategy, especially among certain groups, to get people to isolate themselves. And other channels have talked about this better than me in regard to the trans issue and the cult aspect of it, where you're encouraged to isolate yourself. You're encouraged to only socialize around other people who identify as trans. You're encouraged to live in a bubble, to not allow yourself to access or be exposed to any information or any opinion that is not already in agreement with you, right? That does happen. Um, and I do think this is a big part of it. But it's not just trans-identified people. I think that's a big part of it, but it does expand beyond that to where, in order to keep people in an ideology, an effort is made to get you to cut anyone off who doesn't already agree with that ideology or doesn't support it 100%. Um, Again, I don't think this is super intentional, but it is a clear strategy that, whether intentional or not, is used in a lot of progressive spaces where, you will see a lot of stuff about people cutting off family members who don't agree with them, right? Your uncle who voted for Donald Trump, there was a lot of encouragement around, that 2016 timeframe when he was first elected. You saw a lot of talk in progressive spaces about cutting people off and cutting conservative family members off. And I mean, that's wrong for so many reasons. First of all, whose mind are you going to change if you're not talking to that person? Second, probably more important, if your ideology cannot stand up to another person criticizing it, your ideology is wrong and bad, and you need to sit down and have, like, a real think here, because, you know, any good personal philosophy, any good outlook on the world is based on interaction, and it's based on the details of it changing based on what you observe and what you see and what other people say to you and the sort of discussions you have and all that. And if you're cutting that process off, that does in some sense come across to me as an intentional strategy to keep people from not criticizing aspects of the progressive left that they don't like, or that maybe don't hold water, don't hold up to scrutiny. And the strategy, instead of fixing that, instead of discussing that, instead of working out, a stronger argument or a stronger belief to stand in the place of what gets taken down, is just to say, oh, well, you shouldn't be exposing yourself to anything that's critical of this, right? And that's just, that's stupid. Like, you should absolutely be exposing yourself to things that are critical of your beliefs. And if you're not doing that, you're missing out, and you're intellectually stagnating, and you're not going to improve yourself. You're not going to improve your arguments. You're not going to understand the world better if you're stuck in the specific philosophy that can't be exposed to other philosophies, or the whole thing collapses, or it doesn't work out anymore. I mean, and I know people say, oh, well, we're protecting ourselves from what? From an idea? And this is really common with trans-identified people, that they're told that, well, you need to protect yourself from outsiders. You need to not expose yourself to that. Don't read anything that's turfy. Don't read anything that's gender critical, because that'll just hurt your feelings and upset you. And there's this intentional ignorance and this intentional avoidance of the discussion of the fact that discomfort is inherent to growth, right? If something makes you uncomfortable, if an idea makes you uncomfortable, the answer is to lean in and find out why. Because if you don't do that, you're never going to improve and you're never going to figure out why it makes you uncomfortable. And the thing is, if you lean into it and you realize why it makes you uncomfortable and you decide, well, I still don't agree with that and this is why, and you've thought about it and now you've used that sense of discomfort to come up with a new reasons or add new arguments to why you believe what you believe, well, then that thing won't make you uncomfortable anymore, right? What's making you uncomfortable is this uncertainty. What's making you uncomfortable is this anxiety of, oh, maybe I'm wrong. So the answer to that is to lean into it and to figure out why you're uncomfortable and either change your opinion or reason it through and figure out why you still think what you originally thought. And the fact that people are discouraged from doing that, I see, the being cut up off from family as part of that because, most people are friends with people who are similar to them. Coworkers you may or may not even have conversations like that with. A lot of times, politics in the workplace is discouraged. And the main people, right? Because you go on the internet, who are you going to be around? Probably other people who agree with you. The main people who we are around who disagree with us, who will challenge us in our lives, are our family members. And so I think that's where partially this comes from, this encouragement to cut people off, along with just a general, morally puritanical outlook that has just taken hold of the entire left in a really disturbing manner. There's just this intellectual fragility that's a part of it. And instead of responding to that by making your intellectual arguments less fragile, the response is no, you just shouldn't interact, you shouldn't argue with other people. And your family is like your Achilles heel in that regard because they're the people who you're obligated to be around, and they're the people who aren't afraid to tell you what they think, right? Usually, I mean, not all families are like that, but I sure as shit know my family, if they think I'm wrong about something, they're not going to hold back. It's not like with somebody who you just casually know or a friend who you want to keep on your good side and you're just like, whatever, it's not worth arguing with them. Like, no, my family likes to argue and they're going to argue with me. And I think a lot of families are like that. And that's healthy and that's important. It's important to have your beliefs challenged and to learn and become better and become intellectually better. At least to me, that's extremely important. That's a big value of mine, is intellectual improvement and intellectual rigor. And when I'm wrong, the fact that I have people around me who, as soon as they notice that I've slipped up or left something out, they're going to tell me and they're going to start arguing with me, that has been a big part of who I am. That's a formative experience to me, is the fact that my family is very argumentative. And, although the mental gymnastics were hard at times, retrospectively, I wouldn't be who I am. And I feel like intellectually and emotionally, I would be a lot weaker without that. And I really am concerned that people are taking it to this level where they really are willing to cut off family members just because, they voted for Donald Trump or whatever. I think that's awful, and nobody should ever do that. And the encouragement to do that is, if we're going to describe something as toxic, let's talk about progressive expectations for personal behavior. That's not to say that it's okay to sexually assault people or whatever. Nobody's taking it. Well, somebody will, but I'm not saying that. I'm saying the expectation of people never doing anything wrong, and every time they do something wrong, they'd better be held accountable. That is super bad. No. We all do things that are wrong, especially to our family members. We are all mean sometimes. Some people are meaner than others, but absolutely not. Not a reason to cut off your family. Not a reason to stop talking to somebody just because you had a fight with them or whatever. And it really does seem to have reached that level in certain circles. And I think the pandemic kind of enlightened some people to how dangerous it is to be alone and how much worse that is when you don't have that ultimate backup of family. So many people during the pandemic, including, my siblings, I moved back home just before. A lot of people went back to their parents' house, and a lot of people needed that and needed that social support because otherwise we were expected to isolate ourselves. And people who didn't have that really suffered. And there's this big gap between the experiences of people like me and, people in my neighborhood who moved back in with their parents. And, the pandemic was almost like there were all these wonderful aspects to it of like getting back in touch with your family and, getting to spend more time with them and all that, and compare that to people who lived by themselves and, you know, maybe for reasons other than obviously not. There are many reasons why people didn't necessarily move back in with their family, but like that experience of isolation was clearly extremely brutal for a lot of people. And I think, if anything, that kind of demonstrates part of the point of how important family is and why you need to keep your family around unless they are so actively harmful to you that you can't talk to them. And I really stand by that. I think it's extremely important. So that wasn't as organized as I would have hoped, but nonetheless, thus ends today's edition of Opinions That Nobody Asked For. Um, I really do think that, if we want to make any progress, if we want the left to get better, um, for we need to present a viable alternative to a conservative vision of society. And a vision where people are isolated, where expectations of behavior are so high that, long term relationships are essentially impossible, um, where people are lonely, where religion is actively discouraged unless it's, an alternative spirituality or a minority religion, right? Where people are kind of trashed for being Christians, but they're not trashed if their religion is literally anything else. Um, I don't think that's a viable vision, and I don't think that's one that even the people currently involved will stick with over the long term in life. And there needs to be an option for a kind of progressivism, a kind of caring about other people, a kind of desire for social progress and for better social policy, better support for the poor, um, better social welfare systems that is not so ideologically terrible. um, this idea of like our way or the highway, and that this kind of behavior is acceptable and that it's acceptable to cut people off who aren't perfect, and that it's, this is our vision of basically people being robots, of people acting perfectly, and if they don't act perfectly, they need to be corrected immediately. You can't just like leave it alone and get over it. Um, it's not good, it's not realistic, and it's not something that people will want to stick to. And so I think the left needs to really reevaluate its relationship with tradition and culture and family and religion and these things that are sort of stereotypically held to be right wing values, but really they're kind of, they're semi universal values. And if you cede those values to the right, you kind of cede your argument, because the vision that you have for your society is not one that most people can get on board with, especially if it involves people isolating themselves and actively making themselves miserable. So that's my opinion. There's no real good way. I'm not good at ending things or making conclusions to things. So that's it. I just felt like making a video today. This was on my mind this afternoon, so I thought I would talk about it. If anybody watched, thank you. Goodbye.